Earlier this year, I put out a video that was titled 5 Myths About Old School Yu-Gi-Oh! And pretty much every single entry on that list was taken from a comment that I frequently got. So for example, I get a lot of comments from people on my Magic Cylinder videos saying, well, this card was a lot better in old school Yu-Gi-Oh! When you only had 4,000 life points. Or I get some comments from people that say when I mention that Dark Magician isn't very good or Blue Eyes isn't very good, that they say, well, those cards are better when you didn't have to tribute for them. And I wanted to make that video because these are things that I felt were myths about older school Yu-Gi-Oh! And even on that video, you can still find people disagreeing with what I was saying, which is perfectly fine, but that's where that video kind of came from. And one of the things that I've been thinking about recently especially is that there are also a lot of myths about modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Mostly coming from casual players or ex-players or old school players, and that's perfectly fine. You know, if you haven't played in 5 or 10 years, you shouldn't be expected to know everything about modern Yu-Gi-Oh! That makes complete sense to me, but if you don't know everything about modern Yu-Gi-Oh! You maybe shouldn't leave some of these complaints if they aren't really real. And there certainly are a lot of real complaints that people can have about modern Yu-Gi-Oh! You don't have to like the game as it is in its current form. I mean, the game is obviously way more complicated than it was 10, 15 years ago, and the barrier to entry is way higher than it ever has been. Those are certainly valid complaints, but the ones that I want to focus on are the ones maybe are exaggerated a little bit or maybe a lot of bit by the old school community about modern Yu-Gi-Oh! And keep in mind here, when we're talking about these things, I'm saying them as generically as humanly possible. Just because something is true one particular format doesn't mean it's always true in every format for every deck. So if this video ages poorly because one particular format has a couple of these that are actually true, just keep in mind I'm talking generically as possible and sort of summarizing what the formats have looked like over the past couple of years. First off, the very first myth that I want to talk about that I see a lot of comments about is Yu-Gi-Oh! Isn't as popular right now as it was in older school Yu-Gi-Oh! And the people that leave these types of comments, you know, I get where they're coming from. They say things like, Konami should just hard reset the game so that more of the old school players would join the tournament so the game was popular once again. When you look at tournament numbers though, the game is more popular now than it ever was. I mean, the biggest tournaments back in the day, and I remember, I mean, these were really big deals. You had about 100 to maybe 300 people at them for a very, very long time. And I'm going to talk about a few of the reasons why tournaments were smaller later on in this video, but just keep in mind that right now, pretty much all the regionals that we have, which is like the second level up from locals, are about the same size as the biggest events from 10, 15 years ago used to be. And sure, as time goes on, you know, games get more and more popular, but back in the day, you had Shonen Jump Championships and you had national events during the summer. In most cases, these tournaments, outside of very special occasions during very specific events, did not hit 1,000 players. Right now though, the regional events, which is like one step up from locals, reach more players than both of those events usually hit. I mean, definitely more than the average Shonen Jump Championship, which was like the premier event of older school Yu-Gi-Oh! You have these regional qualifiers hitting those types of numbers, and the YCSs, which is the Shonen Jump equivalent, those ones are hitting like at least 1,000 people, sometimes up to 2,000, and then the national equivalent is hitting well over 2,000 every single year and growing. This goes for pretty much any game, but just try to keep in mind with Yu-Gi-Oh! Just because you're not playing it and just because your friends aren't playing it doesn't mean the game isn't popular anymore. The second myth is that rogue decks aren't viable at tournaments anymore, whereas in old school Yu-Gi-Oh! You could just take a pile of cards and be really, really successful. And this is actually two different answers. So first off, are the decks that you used to build as a kid, just a pile of cards, viable at tournaments? Well, the answer is no, but the answer is also no for old school Yu-Gi-Oh! I talked a little bit about this in that last video 6 months ago, but a lot of people had this idea that old school Yu-Gi-Oh! Did not have a metagame, but where that really stems from is that they weren't part of the metagame, they weren't going to tournaments, so they had no idea what was going on. And it's perfectly fine enjoying this game from a casual perspective. I myself didn't go to a lot of tournaments back in the day, so I also didn't know about the meta that was being played, but that doesn't mean it didn't exist at a tournament level. So those pile of just shoebox commons that you had back in the day and you beat all of your friends at school with, that stuff wasn't very viable at tournaments 15 years ago and also still isn't viable right now. But what if we're not talking about a shoebox full of cards? Well, in that case, if we're talking about real rogue decks, the answer is yes, they are very viable right now. Now, I'm saying that because a lot of the times when I get those comments, I think people are coming from that sort of shoebox perspective or something very, very close. maybe don't realize it. No, you can't buy 3 copies of a starter deck and spend no extra money and expect to win the next tournament you enter, unless that tournament is also filled with people that did that exact same thing. But that is also true for old school Yu-Gi-Oh! And one of the things that you can find if you look throughout Yu-Gi-Oh's history is that different formats are more advantageous to rogue strategies. You know, if you look back in like Darkram Dragon Return, you really couldn't play a rogue deck. If you weren't playing Darkram Dragon Return, you were losing. That's how it went back then. And while there are some formats in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Like that as well, we haven't really had one of those for about a year and a half or 2 years at this point, but overall, no matter which era of Yu-Gi-Oh! You look at, there are certain formats where rogue decks are more popular or less popular. That's just how the game goes. Myth number 3 about modern Yu-Gi-Oh! That a lot of old school players think, especially in the videos where I call certain cards worse than others, is that every single card right now that's good can't be targeted, can't be destroyed, and is unaffected by card effects. This comes from me saying that certain cards, like the God cards, aren't very good because they don't have a lot of protection effects. So I'll get people coming into the comment section and saying things like, oh, you just don't think these cards are good because it can be targeted, because it can be destroyed. If it had like those modern protection effects, then this card would be super broken like the rest of the cards in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! And while you can cherry pick certain examples of cards that can't be targeted or cards that can't be destroyed, and even smaller amounts of examples of cards that are unaffected by card effects, in general, it's not really what separates modern cards from old school cards. To me personally, I think the biggest thing that separates old cards and new cards is that new cards gain a lot of advantage and can be summoned back really, really easily or have floating abilities in the graveyard. A lot of cards out there don't really have that many on-field protection effects. That's not the biggest deal right now. The bigger deal is that if your board gets broken, you can then rebuild it pretty easily on your next turn. So whoever's breaking your board not only has to deal with what you have right now, but also what you can put up on the next turn. And that is a big difference, but it doesn't mean that all cards can be not targeted or not destroyed. It just means that the game is a little bit different and has a lot more momentum after turn 1 than old school Yu-Gi-Oh! This is also why when I make fun of cards like Blue Eyes Chaos Max Dragon, people get so angry because they're like, well, this card is super strong. It can't be targeted. It can't be destroyed. It has 4,000 attack. That is super, super good, right? Well, the answer is that even if a card has 4,000 attack and a bunch of protection effects and a double piercing damage effect, that doesn't necessarily mean that the card itself is actually good just because the card might look good on paper. And that's one of the things that I've talked about in many videos. How some people take that though is that, okay, if he's saying this huge card, this big blue eyes that can't be targeted and can't be destroyed isn't very good, well, how crazy do modern cards look like? Do they all have these protection effects? Better not check any of those. I'll just complain about modern Yu-Gi-Oh! In the comment section and then never look up any of those cards. In reality, a lot more goes into making a card great than just how good it is on the field. You have to look at how easy it is to summon and what decks it can be played in and how good it is against the metagame. So no, just because Chaos Max isn't good doesn't mean every single card out there in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Also has those protection effects in addition to their normal abilities. Myth number 4, the game is more expensive right now than it was 10 or 15 years ago. And whenever I see this comment, I really just can't take that person seriously because it couldn't be further from the truth. The thing about modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Is that there are so many more reprint tins and reprint sets and reprints and structure decks than there were back in the day. Really look back at some of those old school decks and how many of the cards in them never got reprinted until like years later, which made the decks insanely expensive. I mean, I don't just want to talk about Darkram Dragon Return, but that really was like the only deck you could play at a tournament and actually have some real success for that entire format, and even a little bit after the emergency balance as well. I mean, a couple other decks are viable at that point, but for a long period of time, months actually, it was just actually insane because that was the only deck you could play and it cost at least $1,500, and if you wanted to have a huge advantage and actually own Crush Card Virus, you're looking at over $3,000 just for like one card in your entire deck. Certainly there are expensive cards in modern Yu-Gi-Oh, but I think any budget player that's played both in modern Yu-Gi-Oh and old school Yu-Gi-Oh would pretty easily be able to tell you that modern Yu-Gi-Oh is so much easier for budget players. Like, it's not even close how much easier and inexpensive this game is compared to old school Yu-Gi-Oh. The biggest difference right now at least is the Megatins, these reprint sets that pretty much guarantee any card will be reprinted at least once after it was printed just 1 year later. That might not sound like a big deal, but in old school Yu-Gi-Oh there were so few reprint sets, so few reprints and tins that you really just just didn't know sometimes. Cards would go 3 years without getting reprinted. And sure, from a collector's standpoint, I guess that is better for you, but from an entry standpoint, it is a huge help that you can actually not have to spend hundreds of dollars to a top deck. You can just wait a little bit and get all the top cards a little bit later than everyone else. Konami has actually done a fantastic job sort of making structure decks that are competitively viable. I've done an entire series talking about how bad, even in old school context, the old school structure decks actually were, but right now and for the past like 3 or 4 years, there have been multiple structure decks that you can just buy 3 copies of for $30 and actually take to a local tournament and do pretty well. No, they're not starter decks like I mentioned earlier. I'm sure I'll still get one comment from that. Starter decks and structure decks are very, very different things, but in general, structure decks right now are leagues better in the context of the modern era of Yu-Gi-Oh! Than the older structure decks were in the context of old school Yu-Gi-Oh! And then the final myth that I want to talk about is that a lot of old school players seem to think that modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Is all about setting up 5 or 6 or 7 negates on the very first turn. Right now is actually a fantastic time to disprove this because the top deck right now ends on 1 interruption, sometimes 2 if it opens well, depending on what you're playing in your deck, but overall the best decks right now usually are just ending on 1, maybe 2 negations. Sure, there are some bigger combo decks in the format, but Konami has given us so many anti-combo tools that combo decks aren't nearly as prevalent right now as they were even like 2-3 years ago. And I'm saying this because, like I mentioned earlier, the big reason the top decks are so good right now isn't because they're setting up infinite negations, it's rather because they have a lot of momentum after you break their board, and that is a whole nother discussion, but keep in mind here, the modern decks might seem a lot more powerful than they actually are if you play against them with your 10-year-old strategy. And I know people complain about that, yes, your deck that you played back in 2009 isn't very viable anymore, but is that really that crazy? I mean, do you actually expect in any game to have the same sort of success that you did 10 years ago without changing a single thing? If the game was that stagnant, it probably wouldn't be around 10 years later. There has to be some sort of power creep, there has to be some sort of progression. Sure, some games use set rotation, and that's a little bit different from Yu-Gi-Oh, but even in Pokemon, I mean, there's a ton of videos out there that are really great explaining that even though there is set rotation, the power creep is still there. Cards right now look way more powerful than cards from 10 years ago. That is just how games work. If you're an old school player that stumbled upon this video, I hope you learned something along the way. I'm just trying to break up any sort of misguided opinions out there about modern Yu-Gi-Oh! I love all eras of Yu-Gi-Oh! I've been playing this game since I was a little kid, so I understand where people are coming from when they talk about the good old days, but modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Isn't nearly as bad as a lot of ex-players seem to make it out to be. Anyway though, I'll see you guys later. Thank you so much for watching today's discussion video. Goodbye.